Hey everybody, what is up? It is Dr. Vibe, your host of the Good Men Project show monthly at thegoodmenproject.com, one of the most viewed sites in the world for men. And I'm looking forward to another great conversation this month. Have two outstanding gentlemen on the line with us via Google Hangout to talk about a very important and very newsworthy topic. But before we get into that, I'll introduce both of them. First of all, we have Christopher Anderson. He's the executive director of Male Survivor, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping male survivors of sexual abuse and their loved ones by creating communities of hope, healing, and support. Welcome, Christopher. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me, Dr. Vibe.
Well, it's good to have you good and clean this time.
Yes.
Last time we tried it, it just didn't happen. But we don't quit until we win. It's not over till we win, right?
That's right. That's right.
Excellent. And we're joined also tonight by David Pisarra. He is the founder of Men's Family Law. He's a father's right attorney, author of 3 books for men on divorce and child custody. He is a producer and a professional speaker and a podcaster. So I have a special care for you, Dave. I've been podcasting for 9 years, so I received that. That's good stuff.
Ah, great.
Excellent. And his Family Law podcast is available on iTunes. And if you check the description at this post, you'll be able to see where you can get it. So thank you, gentlemen, for making your time available for us tonight.
Happy to be here.
Excellent. Well, we're going to be talking about a very interesting subject tonight, men and sexual trauma from a personal and legal perspective. And Dave brought this to the floor, so to speak, digital floor, in regards to the topics of Shia LeBoef, Bill Cosby, and the kerfuffle between Don Lemon and Piers Morgan about fighting back. We've thought at the Good Men Project would be an outstanding time to have this discussion. So, Dave, I'm going to let you lead. Why did you want to bring this to the Good Men Project to discuss via Google Hangout?
Well, I think that one of the biggest problems men are facing today is the fact that they don't feel empowered to protect themselves. You know, they don't feel empowered to deal with domestic violence. They don't feel empowered to go ahead and call the police when they're being abused. They don't feel empowered in many areas professionally. We don't feel it personally. And so I think that Chris will back me up on this when I say it's by talking about this stuff that we share it, and then we get other men to feel the power and to feel it's okay to start talking about the things that oftentimes we feel great shame and guilt around. And it's only by airing them that we're ever going to make progress. So that was my main point.
Chris, can you carry up on that for us?
Sure, absolutely. You know, and I think it's really key that we hone in on the idea of empowerment, because there's there's a lot of fault lines when we start looking into some of these conversations, and especially when we talk about men in power, because I think there are a lot of people who see this from a framework of dominant paradigms and narratives about patriarchy and a male power structure that is arguably very toxic. One of the unintended consequences, though, of having set up, I think, a lot of systems to respond to what are very, very legitimate, very real issues around violence against women and other areas of oppression, we've made it in some ways very difficult for men who have themselves been victimized in various ways to be able to come forward and to disclose their victimization, as David said, to be able to report it, to have their stories heard, both in a criminal justice perspective, but also from even sometimes a civil perspective when you're dealing with some of the issues that David specializes in.
Excellent. I want to delve deeper into some of the conversation pieces that both of you already brought up. This whole area of empowerment. Where does this stand when it comes to this issue, this area of empowerment and the issue we're talking about or sharing about this evening? So either one can start on that.
Chris, you want to take that?
Sure. Well, I think one of the things that we have not done a very good job defining is what is it that an empowered, healthy, non-toxic man looks like. We've done a lot of work around defining the boundaries, so to speak, of what toxic masculinity looks like. And I think, unfortunately, there are some commentators and I think some perspectives out there that associate anything to do with men and masculinity as itself toxic. I think part of what we need to be thinking about as we're having these conversations is creating a sense of empowerment that brings everybody up to the same level, regardless of their identity, regardless if they're male, female, regardless of their racial identity, their sexual identity, their, any of the ways in which we oftentimes silo and subdivide ourselves into categories. There are basic human rights that we are all entitled to enjoy, and I would include among some of those the right to not be abused. And it is when we set up, structures and systems to respond to traumas and abuses in our society that wind up, in some instances, creating a different class of victims. We're basically we're setting up a system that doesn't work, and we need to be able to have discussions about that. We need to be able to talk about that in ways that don't, inflame some of the partisan debates that sometimes come up when we start to deal with these issues, because abuse thrives on silence, and whenever we're silencing any survivor of any form of abuse or trauma, we're disempowering that person. So the work that we're trying, the work that I'm engaged in, and I think the kinds of things that we need to try and be focusing on when we talk about empowerment is how are we enabling every person's voice to be heard in a respectful and supportive way.
Chris, I want to jump in here. You just said you were talking about systems that don't work, and this is where I think that on the one hand, we've created a system like with domestic violence, like with rape awareness, like with sexual trauma awareness, but the next level of that is getting the word out, and that's why I think what we're doing is so important, is that it's letting men know that those systems do exist and that they're gender neutral. Oftentimes in my practice, I see men who clearly, from my perspective, have been abused, they are victimized, they are targeted by pathological personalities. And when I say, go get a restraining order, go talk to the police, go do something, they're not aware that the system is actually gender neutral. And that's why I have to get out there and start sharing more to get men to hear that, and I need to know what a better way to do this would be, that they actually do have powers, that these systems are in place. I don't think it's the systems don't work, it's that we don't work the systems. I am often told that abuse lives in silence, and that's true, but how do you get people to start talking about it if they're so scared that the system isn't going to support them?
I want to interject there, and I was going to build on that, on why isn't this being spoken about more? Like, why are men, why is general society keeping silent on this subject in each one of your opinions?
Well, I think there's.
I think it harkens back to a false sense of chivalry, of a man is supposed to fall on his sword to protect his lady like a knight. There's this weird sense of you're supposed to provide for and you're supposed to act as a macho man, and that anything less than that makes you less than a man, and it's a feminization if you're actually acknowledging the fact that you've been targeted for abuse. So as a consequence, men don't feel like they're allowed to admit that they're being attacked by a female or by another male.
Chris?
I think there's a lot to what David is saying there. We have a way in which we define culturally masculinity as something that oftentimes, we associate masculinity with very, very toxic norms. The idea that a real man is somebody who, to bring in some other pieces of this, somebody who never asks for help, who is strong and silent and doesn't talk about his pain, who goes out and is prepared to fight every battle and win the day and beat off all enemies and all challengers come what may. There's people, I think, oftentimes misunderstand what the idea of survival of the fittest means, and people tend to think that to be an alpha male, to be top dog, is the thing that is the most is what really truly makes you a man. And every person goes through periods in their life where they are powerless. That's just part of being human. And the more that we try to deny that truth or pretend that it isn't a part of what we need to deal with as human beings, the more we're setting up cultural norms that I think inevitably create these sort of toxic perspectives around what a man is supposed to be. Nobody gets to 30 unscathed in this world. And oftentimes the people who try the hardest to put out an air of invulnerability are usually hiding some of the deepest wounds.
You know, it's interesting you talk about, you use that word vulnerability, and as you were speaking, I was thinking of Brene Brown's TED Talk.
Mm-hmm.
And she talks about being in a book signing and a man coming up and saying, you know, my wife and daughter would rather I die than see me cry or admit that I'm vulnerable. And yet that's what keeps them apart. It's the lack of vulnerability that actually causes relationship problems. You know, it's the thing that causes divorces. It's the thing that causes alcohol, doesn't cause alcoholism, but it certainly contributes to drug and alcohol problems as we're self-medicating because we're not allowed to get honest with each other.
Yeah.
You know, and it's interesting to me, like in my men's group, when I see guys who come in and they're covered in tattoos and piercings and they've got this big air of bravado and this super tough dude, you know, and 2 months later they're crying like babies because they're actually marshmallows inside because they're so scared. And then they get honest, and then they get open, and they let all that pain out, then they get to be real.
Yeah. When people are fighting to not show that vulnerability to the world, which sometimes we're trained to do because the few times maybe we did show that when we were children, you know, it was really, you know, it was a terrible situation. You know, maybe we had people make fun of us or beat us up or take advantage of that vulnerability in ways that, you know, established these ideas that a real man doesn't talk or a real man doesn't cry.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, and when we are when you talked about self-medicating, I think that's such an important, you know, piece of this, to carry that burden silently inside, to try and hide all of that pain and to not be able to really express it in ways that are open and honest, is something that, you know, leads to tremendous distress, tremendous discomfort, and is part of what drives a lot of men into maladaptive behaviors, be it some form of substance abuse, be it sometimes overachieving at work, where you define your success by how much money you make, or, you know, how many deals you settle and score, or how many, you know, how successful you are at climbing the ladder. And if we wind up seeing men, you know, all throughout the lifespan who sort of look back on the wreckage of their lives going, you know, how did everything get destroyed?
Yeah, because they're never allowed to actually get to the old hurts. I mean, I know from my own experience, for years, those taunts I suffered in high school carried me as, you know, a way to, like, continue my drinking. It allowed me to continue my overeating. It allowed me to continue avoiding things because I was so scared that someone was going to hurt me again. It's only when I was able to, like, face it and get vulnerable that I was able to move on with my life and get a better life.
I want to go ahead, Chris. No problem. I'm just enjoying this conversation. No problem. I mean, I'm just here as a filler. You guys are rocking.
Well, I want to go back to sort of backtrack for just a second, though, and talk about sort of the, you know, another piece of why there's sort of the systems don't really seem to work sometimes for men. And I think part of the problem is we have this definition of masculinity that oftentimes is very toxic. But often, you know, David said that the systems are created in gender-neutral ways, the justice system, the way the laws are supposed to be applied, and things like that. However, in reality, the ways in which the systems wind up manifesting themselves aren't gender inclusive or gender neutral. There is a very, very heavy orientation, shall we say, towards trying to find the right way to say this. There's a blind spot to male victimization in the way that all of our response systems, be they social services, be they health and human services, be they the criminal justice system. There's a blind spot to trauma itself, but really especially the experience of male trauma. And it creates strong disincentives for men to come forward and disclose any experiences of victimization because they're not going to be heard by the system, and oftentimes they get treated worse when they do come out and speak about these things.
Absolutely, and I think that one of the big reasons for that is it's this false sense of chivalry coming back to a false sense of masculinity. We're back to you as a man should be able to accept a hit from a woman. You as a man should be able to accept abuse. And if you can't, there's something wrong with you. But that's a bunch of BS, because the question really should be, why is she or he abusive? The focus needs to be on the abuser, not on the victim.
Well, I would actually say the norm needs to be shifted to one where we're saying it's never okay for a person to abuse anybody. It's never justifiable. And
right.
It doesn't matter whether the perpetrator is male, female, or something in between, or whether the victim is male, female, or transgender, or whatever they want to identify as. As a human being, if you have been abused, that means somebody has chosen to inflict trauma on you. That's wrong.
Right. But we as a society, the way we couch things, we set that up as a structure that allows women to be the victims and men can't be victims, because if they are, then they're women. So we're feminizing men when they say that they've been abused. It's a difference between Nicole Brown Simpson and Travis Alexander. One was a victim of domestic violence, one was a murder victim of a crazy woman. They both suffered the same trauma. They both had the same injuries, and they're both just as dead. But one is a poster child for domestic violence, and one is just a victim. And I think that there's a huge difference. And I think that it's that difference that actually keeps men silent.
I just want to interject, and you guys are rocking really good right now, in the fact you both mentioned about the feminization of culture. Why has this become the situation? Why do you both feel the culture has become feminized?
Well, I don't necessarily think that the culture has become feminized, or that that there's anything necessarily wrong with some of the are becoming more empowered around talking about emotions and making a space for some of those kinds of discussions to happen. I don't think that men are being emasculated by women's rights coming forward, or women's values becoming more and more a part of how we gauge what norms are. But I think that there's certainly ways in which we sort of set up this false dichotomy of men's rights versus women's rights, and there's a human rights question that's central to all of this, and that's, I think, where we need to be coming down on all of this, because the more and more we spend our energy and our time getting into debates about women's rights versus men's rights and who's right, who's wrong, I think we miss the point, and we miss where it is that we can actually be coming together.
Dave?
I agree with you, and one of the things that I always say is that it's not about bashing women. It's not about taking something away from them. It's about empowering men. It's about getting them to see that they have a better place in society, and that it's okay for them to stand up for themselves in ways that they haven't historically done. On the one hand, we're coming from a perspective that man has always been in charge of society, and that's changed over the last 30 years dramatically. But we haven't counterbalanced that in terms of our relationship powers and our relationship roles. And I think that that's something that we need to talk further about.
Okay. More than fair. Getting back to the main core subject about the trauma that men are experiencing sexually, and maybe it's an obvious question, but I want you both to speak to the power of it. Is it becoming more prevalent Why is it becoming more prevalent? And what are men telling you about this subject? If they are speaking, the ones that are speaking, what are they telling you?
I do not believe that the sexual abuse of males is happening more. I
Okay.
think what we are seeing is more and more men are beginning to feel safe enough to come forward and talk about it. This is something that we're seeing in the military. Most of the people who are dealing with around military sexual abuse will agree. They don't think that there's an increase in the amount of sexual violence that's happening within the services. They believe that they're seeing more and more victims come forward and disclose. Same dynamic with campus sexual violence. It's easy to draw the conclusion that there's more and more abuse happening because we're hearing about it more and more. But that's not the takeaway that we want people to hear. We need to be hearing about this more often in order to be able to, I think, respond to it and recognize that this really is an issue. The latest, 10 years ago, again, assuming that prevalence hasn't increased at all, 10 years ago, research into sexual victimization of men showed, maybe about 10 to 15% of males reported experiencing some form of sexual trauma. Now, if you look at the latest statistics from the CDC, we actually see something that I think is a little bit closer to what the real numbers are. 1 out of every 4 men at some point in his life is estimated that will experience some form of sexual violence, rape, and that includes rape and many other forms of sexual victimization. So what we're seeing isn't so much a coarsening of the society or I think an increase in the amount of abuse that's happening. What we're starting very slowly to see is an environment in which survivors are more and more empowered to come forward. And of course the irony is, as some survivors are coming forward, there's a rush to hear their stories, and we wind up getting these sort of controversies that come up. Like with the Shia LeBoef thing, Shia's story didn't ring true for a couple of people. And so they decided to go on the rampage against him and say, how dare you come forward and speak about this? As opposed to offering him a sense of, empathy and saying, wow, that's a terrible thing that you experienced that. And that is it's a response that we see over and over and over again with male victims. I can't tell you how many male victims have told me that the first time they disclosed, what they got was either disbelief or a bullying response or basically being shut down.
I think that that's a really important key that you've just identified there. And I know from my own experience that oftentimes when men start opening up in my office and they disclose something about this, they're so nervous about it. And because I have the professional face that I put on of, you're not going to shock me, they feel comfortable. But I know that oftentimes when I talk to other people, they don't know how to respond. And I think that that might be one of the big educational components that we need to work on is how do you respond when somebody discloses to you that they've been a victim or that they've been abused? Because oftentimes if they learn how to respond appropriately, they will then create the environment where more people will open up to them. Mm-hmm. Is that something that rings true to you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think there are really 3 key elements to how we should respond to a survivor who discloses a serious trauma, be it sexual violence or some other really, really terrible experience. And I wrote about this actually on Good Men Project in one of my articles recently. Are you strong enough to listen? There's really 3 steps. If somebody says to you, for instance, Dr. Vibe, I had this terrible thing. I think I was raped. What I suggest is the proper response is listen, don't say anything, give them a safe space to be able to disclose and talk more as they're starting to test their waters. Believe them, and don't try to fix it. And in terms of what we should say in response, I think the very first thing that should come out of our mouths is thank you. Because when a man especially shares an experience of having been victimized or shares their vulnerability with you, they're giving you a gift that almost can't be measured in value. They're opening up in a way that is difficult, in ways that are almost indescribable for many men. So when a man opens up in that way, that's a very, very powerful moment. And if we don't say the right thing, or if we don't give them a sense of safety and reinforcement, oftentimes we're just driving them back into silence for potentially years.
I think that's
and that's one of the factors that I think, when Dr. Bai was asking, why are we just hearing more about it now? I think one of the reasons also is that it takes so long for men to feel comfortable that something actually happened. It's not like they have something happen and then the next day they're ready to talk about it. It can take months and years and lots of therapy to get them to the point where they're willing to start discussing this stuff.
And just the same dynamics are at play with, for instance, female victims of sexual violence, which is something we've been hearing about so much in the aftermath of the UVA article, and whether or not, that there were discrepancies in this woman Jackie's story. Well, anybody who's actually done any work with trauma survivors or sexual abuse survivors knows that, regardless of whether you're a man or woman, the brain in traumatic memories are not processed in the same way that quote-unquote normal memories are. The response that a victim of sexual violence will oftentimes have is not the response that people necessarily expect. And if we could have conversations that enable all survivors to come forward and talk about this, regardless of male or female, and we could see the commonalities of the trauma response, I think it would open up more opportunities and more reasons for people to feel safe enough to come forward.
Chris, I just want to interject on it. You two are going, so I just want to drop in and just say, I love your statement, are you strong enough to listen? I think that's a very powerful statement. No matter what, especially with this type of situation, but any situation, are you strong enough to listen? So I just want to interject because you two are having a nice flow, so I don't want to interrupt. Dave, do you want to carry on further, or I can also bring up another conversation piece? But if
I tell you, why don't you guys carry on for a minute? I'm going to go grab some headphones. I'll be right back.
No problem. Yeah, because Dave's just getting a little bit of echo, so we want to reduce it. So, Chris, in this, with those three things that you mentioned, in regards to those three things, which one is the toughest one for people to lock into, in your opinion?
I think the one that I have a hardest time explaining to people sometimes is the importance of saying thank you when a survivor shares their story with you. Oftentimes, the response kind of goes into one of two categories. You have some people who immediately want to offer a tremendous amount of support and say, I'm so sorry that happened to you, and offer, some kind of emotional boost or reinforcement. And oftentimes, especially with male victims, that can be the exact wrong thing to do, because there are times where I have told my story and I have had people almost overreact with emotion, and all of a sudden I find myself feeling like I have to take care of them because my story was so traumatizing for them to hear. And now all of a sudden the focus is no longer on me talking about my vulnerability, it's now this other person needing to be reassured that I'm okay. I think the other direction that people sometimes go in is when somebody, shares a story like this. All of a sudden, people become like the detective. They want to know all of the details, and they want to know either how do I fix this problem, or they're suspicious, and before they can offer empathy or support, they need to verify. They need to fact check and make sure that this terrible thing that seems unbelievable really happened. And I think that's one of the worst responses that we've seen coming out of the whole UVA incident. There are so many people now who are jumping from the fact that there are discrepancies in the story that Rolling Stone ran, which they were stupid for running without fact-checking in the first place, to all of a sudden this survivor must be lying. And now we have to fact check every single person who ever comes forward with any disclosure of sexual violence before we can give them any, empathy or sympathy whatsoever. And, here's the thing. If somebody comes forward to you and says that they've been hurt, that in and of itself should be enough to warrant a response of empathy. I don't need to know all of the details of what has happened to you or what has been done to you in order to be able to assist you or support you. I just need to respond in a way that empowers you to tell me more of what happened and maybe what you need from me.
Excellent. Thanks,
Well,
Dave.
Chris, it's interesting when you talk about that because my immediate reaction is like, the lawyer in me comes up and says, but what about the false accuser? What about the guy that's been accused of being a molester who's not? What about the woman who's accused of being a rapist when she's not? How do we protect them? And I think that what you're talking about is like almost a first responder's reaction versus the judge and jury's reaction, and oftentimes people want to cross and blur those lines.
Absolutely.
Think that they can be judge and jury, and that's just something that I think, again, we need to educate people on because it's so not their place. It's not my place to decide whether or not Shia LeBoef was raped, whether or not somebody was actually abused by Bill Cosby, whether or not some other person has been victimized by their father 30 years ago. The only thing I can really do is who's in front of me and how do I support them? And that's something that we need to really, I think, spread that message more. Because we've got people who are trying to do things that they're just not qualified to do.
And this goes, what you were just talking about, this is kind of what started our conversation, Dave, and why we wanted to bring this to Good Men Project. There's this intersection between the legal system and the culture. And people oftentimes apply legal standards as sort of the default, this idea of innocent until proven guilty. Well, that applies in a courtroom. There's a difference between the pursuit of justice and the pursuit of healing. And if we are overly focused on applying all of these standards that are appropriate when we're, when we're engaged in a legal question to, a social response to a problem, then we wind up getting this sort of, into this mess that we have right now where you've got, people who are terrified to come forward and talk, disclose any piece of information about being a sexual abuse survivor without having all of their facts straight beforehand. And I think that's exactly the wrong kind of message we need to be putting out into the society.
Absolutely, because it's just another form of blaming the victim when we're putting them on trial again for something that they can't really prove one way or the other 10, 15, 20 years later in reality. Whether or not somebody's going to be able to prove something is generally a hard call in the best of circumstances, let alone as the sands of time have worn away facts and memories.
Chris, I just wanted to ask you, and you brought up the UVA case, I think two conversation pieces I'd like you to address. First of all, many of our viewers, Good Men Project or via YouTube or whatever, may not know about that case. So can you give some background on it? And then you mentioned about the media, Rolling Stone not doing their background check, basically.
Sure.
So if you can do that part, and then how the media is handling this, and maybe get both of your perspectives on that, and then I'll have a specific question for Dave. So if you can just start that off, Chris.
Sure, absolutely. So a couple of weeks ago, Rolling Stone ran a big article about around the culture of sexual violence that is being talked about more and more on college campuses. And one of the focal points of the story was a disclosure from a student who went by the nickname of Jackie in the article, talking about, and she disclosed a brutal gang rape that she experienced when she was a freshman at a fraternity party. After her story came out, and it created a tremendous amount of attention and outrage against this fraternity and the school itself, leading to the suspension of all fraternity and sorority activities at University of Virginia, and a conversation that's still going on to this moment. A number of reporters started asking questions of, first, the reporter herself who wrote the article for Rolling Stone, and asked her, did you contact the person that was accused? Did you get the other side of the story? Did you fact check the details? And as people started looking into this, they found out that there were actually some discrepancies in some of the details that were reported in the article. And eventually it led to Rolling Stone initially coming out with a statement saying, we put our trust in Jackie, and that appears to have been misplaced, which was an awful, awful thing for Rolling Stone to do. They basically threw Jackie under the bus because they didn't do their own fact-checking before running with the article. And then they subsequently came back and revised that. But, you know, this whole story and the controversy surrounding it created, unfortunately, an atmosphere where it's become very toxic for survivors to disclose and talk about these issues without almost immediately getting shot down.
Uh-oh.
Well, Dave?
Dave?
Is Chris still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay, so
Yep.
Dave, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to, as comfortable as you are, to get your take on how the media is dealing with this issue, and then after that, I'd like you to talk about, as comfortable as you can, how the legal profession is handling this issue, and then also after that have Chris address that. So media first for you, Dave, and then legal system, and then Chris can build in after that. Is that fair?
Sure, sure. You know, I think the media is handling this in a very poor way, as they tend to do, because they're just looking at what's going to be the biggest headlines, going to get the most red ink. You know, our media today has really become very much a if it bleeds, it leads mentality. And you know, the fact that we, on the one hand, had a great story about rape, and then, oh my God, it was a false story about rape, even better. Now we've got all this other stuff we can talk about, and let's all run and rush to judgment on how bad everybody is on that front. And what the big problem is with false accusers and the whole issue with, you know, whether or not there was true journalistic integrity or not. I think it's very depressing to me as someone who is sort of a shirt-tailed journalist. I've been writing a column for 14 years now for the Santa Monica Daily Press, so I've got a little touch of journalism in me, a lot of opinions, but when I see what happens with like the kerfuffle between like Don Lemon and Piers Morgan, it seems to me that the media is not actually stepping back and doing a fair self-assessment. You know? So to address it from the legal perspective, we come back to now when I say it's hard in the best of circumstances to prove a case, now when you add in alcohol, a long time between now and when it actually occurred, so there's memories are fading, memories have changed, witnesses have disappeared, any physical evidence is going to disappear. Now it's that much harder to prove your case, and one of the things they wanted to prove was whether or not there actually was a party at the fraternity on the night that Jackie supposedly was gang raped. Well, who knows if there's any kind of documentation to support that, and now you've got to go back, I think it was, 2-3 years ago, Chris? I don't remember the exact timeline.
That, yeah.
But now you've got to go back with college students who are not exactly known for being the most diligent about record keeping, particularly a group of frat boys. I know from my own college experience, records were not kept of most of the debauchery we did, and I doubt something like this would be documented. So to prove it from a legal perspective is going to be that much harder. So now we've got to find witnesses and hopefully have good witnesses that are going to be credible, in addition to trying to find some sort of document to support whatever the allegations are. So from a legal perspective, it's a very difficult case to make. And that's kind of one of those things where I just see it becomes a mud fest.
Okay. Chris, I want you to expand on just how you feel the legal justice system is handling this issue that we're confronting tonight.
Well, when it comes to the UVA story, we don't yet know how the legal system will deal with it. When it comes to dealing with sexual abuse in general, there are two significant challenges. The first, Dave, I think, has done a really good job touching on the idea that it's difficult oftentimes with rape and sexual abuse cases, especially ones that go back in time, to establish a strong evidence trail. So creating the burden of proof that's necessary for a legal criminal conviction is very, very difficult. Another piece of this, though, is when we deal with sexual abuse, especially childhood sexual abuse, there are statutes of limitations that oftentimes prevent any action whatsoever, any investigation on institutions that may have had serious problems with sexual abuse perpetrators sort of infesting the institution. And this is a story we've seen happen over and over again with the Catholic Church, with the Boy Scouts, with prep schools like Horace Mann, other youth serving organizations. And this actually is one of the times where oftentimes there is an evidence trail because these are big institutions that oftentimes do keep records, but because of statutes of limitations that block us from survivors who may have only now, 20 or 30 years later, are ready to come forward and talk about the abuse they may have experienced in the past. Oftentimes these statutes of limitations block them from being able to have their the accusations heard. Again, I think all of this goes back to this, this challenge of there's a legal standard, which is very important, and I'm not at all suggesting that we need to, undo the legal standard. I think presumption of innocence is the bedrock of our legal system, and it's an important thing. But that shouldn't dictate how we as human beings respond to one another and interact with one another. And time again, I see all of these people, in response to false accusations, let's say, saying that it's just as traumatic for a person to be falsely accused of rape as it is to be raped. I don't want to get into that debate, but one of the things that I think is really important to stress is there are far more men who have been sexually abused than who have been falsely accused of sexual assault. And right now, so much of the oxygen in terms of how this debate is getting played out is on this, is on the false accusation piece, which I'm not saying is not, a valid issue, but it's, an issue that needs to be discussed in conjunction with our response as a society to sexual abuse writ large, and the fact that there's far more men who have been victims than we've ever acknowledged of true sexual assault.
Right.
Well, Chris, you've touched on a lot right there, but one of the things I wanted to hit on was, you said legal standard. Well, there's actually two legal standards.
Yes, you're right.
There's the criminal and there's the civil. And with the civil being so much lower, and actually, what I factor that I think, because there's violence where mom comes in and says that she's afraid that dad might be sexually molesting the children, and that automatically triggers a whole host of events. So there's sort of a third level that doesn't last very long usually. One of the other things that we're talking about is with the false allegations, like in the family law cases, we're seeing more and more of the false allegations, but they're not actually allegations. They're the false fears. There's the fear that he might be, because men are so sexually aggressive all the time, and we're all perverts at heart, and we all have these just horrible, debauched minds. So that fear gets played a lot, which is, I think, one of the reasons why we need to do everything we can when somebody has actually been falsely accused to protect them, at the same time that we need to have a system that does protect the victims in a true case. And here's where it gets difficult is, how do you differentiate between the two?
And
I don't have any good answers on that one.
Well, there's a lot that you just put in there, so let me unpack it a little bit. I absolutely agree with you on so much of what you just said, David. You know, the fear especially goes to, you know, one of the biggest myths that we have to try and combat in terms of working with male victims of sexual abuse and talking about male sexual victimization. It's this thing we call the vampire myth, where there's this misunderstanding, this perception that, you know, any man who has been sexually abused, especially if he was sexually abused in childhood, is now all of a sudden at risk to perpetrate sexual abuse against other children. And I mean, I've had a number of survivors tell me that, you know, when they told their wife, or sometimes now ex-wife, when they first disclosed, their spouses or their partner's first reaction were, "Are my kids safe?" And not, "That's, you know, how can I help?" Or, you know, I mean, I mean, that response as the first response is so, I think, traumatizing and misinformed. It's terrible. And it goes right to the heart.
It's something I see on a regular basis. I hear that on a regular basis when guys open up. They're like, "I said it, and this is what happened, and now she's afraid," and that's how we end up having to fight these restraining orders. So, sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to back you up on that one.
Yeah, you know, and I think when it comes to how do we respond, how do we know, part of the challenge is we really need to recognize that when we're dealing with issues that are especially this fraught with a misunderstanding and we jump to conclusions, we really need to turn to, you know, I know it's dangerous sometimes to say this, but this is a case where we really legitimately need to turn to the experts. We need to consult, you know, with the people who really truly are experienced in prosecuting child abuse crimes or sex crimes. We need to turn to the people who are experts in investigating and working with survivors. We need to turn to the experts who understand the neurobiology of trauma and who can really help us understand a lot of these dynamics that are at play that aren't necessarily oftentimes talked about enough, when the sole focus, you know, is, you know, did he or didn't she, or was she, you know, was he or wasn't she a victim?
Right. But I think one of the problems that we run into with that is determining who's a good expert versus, say, I have a toilet paper certificate that says I'm an expert. Which I see a lot of in family court.
Yeah, I know.
Differentiating between the good from the bad is crucial and difficult.
Absolutely.
And it's one of those things that unless you do it, you can get hung by those same experts in a far worse situation. That's not necessarily the answer. Yep. Unless you know what you're buying.
Yep.
Very true. Gentlemen, you're just rocking as always. I'm glad I had a moment to step in here. No, it's great. No, it's really great. I'm learning a lot from this, and my mindset is just really growing, and I know a lot of listeners are getting a lot of good stuff here. How, with this subject, when you get a chance to share it with women, if you do get the chance to share it with women, how are they responding?
When we talk about victimization of men, there are two responses that I get. Oftentimes, a positive and a negative one. Oftentimes, I will get a response, and this is the more usual one, of compassion and empathy and support. There are sometimes, however, responses that I get of not just disbelief, but almost a sense of, why are you making this, you know, this issue about you? Why? Right. I mean, this, you know, sexual violence is a violence against women issue. You know, you don't have a place in this dialogue unless you're ready to come in and sort of, you know, it's something that gets me very frustrated. So I have to be, I need to be very, just very careful about how I talk about this.
Yeah, understood.
There is oftentimes a blowback that I think is completely needless from some folks who, you know, really say, you know, talking about sexual violence against men, it's not the time for this discussion to happen right now. Like somehow talking about the sexual violence of any one group of people, you know, detracts from the work of ending sexual violence overall. And it's, you know, it's oftentimes a balancing act that I have to I sort of find myself walking, trying to be very ardent and saying, there's no hierarchy of abuse. Every survivor matters, and not getting misunderstood and being labeled as sort of a rabid anti-feminist.
I will be less politically correct because Chris is much more diplomatic than I am.
Okay.
I get a lot of when I have these conversations. The first reaction is often, "You're joking. A woman can't rape a man. It's not possible. If he got erect, he was interested." And I say that's just not biologically accurate. You're mistaking, and secondarily, you're assuming that it's only women on men. The other one that I get a lot of is, how can that possibly be? Because it is a woman's issue, and you're treading on our territory. Only women are victims of abuse. No man is ever a victim. He should be able to accept it. And whether that goes to being slapped or whether it goes to sexual trauma, there's this ethos that a man is supposed to accept whatever a woman dishes out or whatever another man dishes out. And I just find that it's really appalling, because my first reaction is like, you've got to be kidding me. If I threw that back in your face, you'd be calling me all kinds of names. So it becomes a very difficult conversation for me to have, because I want to just, the bulldog in me comes out, and I just want to immediately attack them and go, how could you possibly say that? I mean, that's just not accurate. And that's not actually moving the ball down the field in terms of educating and empowering men and educating women on the fact that sexual trauma does actually happen, that men can be raped.
Well, you're less diplomatic than Chris, I can tell on that, so no problem. That's all good. Well, gentlemen, as we wind down the conversation here tonight, I'd like to get your final thoughts on this subject and give us some take-homes in regards to this subject. And I think from a take-home for men and also a take-home for women, but also a take-home for our young people. So whoever wants to start first.
This is one of those whoever's more humble start.
Yeah.
I'm gonna say this. I think that the big takeaway for men is to understand that we are strongest when we are most vulnerable. We are actually at our best when we open up and start sharing what's really going on. The takeaway for women is that a man who's big and tough isn't necessarily the biggest, toughest guy in the room. It's the one that can actually get honest about what's really happening is probably the toughest guy in the room. And for the children, for the kids, the teens, they need to know that the images that they have been fed, from whether it was John Wayne when I was a boy to whether it's Buzz Lightyear these days, or maybe it's, I don't know who the latest hero is. Times are changing, and then it's okay to talk about what's happened to you in an honest and open way, and that you will not be shamed and humiliated and guilted as a consequence of something that happened to you.
Well, I'm going to break the rules a little bit, because I think the message for men and women really needs to be the same. It's that men and women can be raped, can be victims of all types of violence and trauma, and it does not matter who you are. There is no hierarchy of abuse. There's no hierarchy of victims. Every single survivor, no matter what it is they've gone through, is deserving of the full measure of our compassion that we can provide to them. I think with regards to sort of the youth, I'm actually really hopeful and excited, because what I'm seeing more and more often, 10 years ago, it was, you would very, very rarely see a man in his teens or early 20s disclose having been sexually victimized. What we're seeing start to happen more and more often is younger men in their late teens and early 20s come forward and say, this has happened to me. And oftentimes they're doing so at great risk to themselves or their standing in their immediate community. But I'm applauding them for doing it, and I hope we see more and more men coming forward, and more people coming to the defense and the support of any survivor who has the courage to come forward and say that, yes, this happened to me too.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for an outstanding conversation tonight. And before we let you go, a big thanks for taking time out of your positive, productive schedules. First thing, David, thanks again. How can people connect with you and your organization?
The best way is to go to mensfamilylaw.com, and there's videos and podcasts and links over to the iTunes, so you can get my Men's Family Law podcast that way.
All right, podcaster. Yeah, hey, good stuff. Excellent. And Christopher, thanks very much. Second time we got it right, got it strong. How can people get in contact with your organization?
That's right. Well, come visit us at malesurvivor.org on the web, or on Facebook at Male Survivor, or on Twitter at MaleSurvivorORG. And it's the holiday season, so we are a nonprofit. We don't receive any support from public funding sources, so anybody who can help support our work this holiday season is truly, truly appreciated.
Excellent. Well, I am your host of the Goodman Project Show, and I also co-produce it with Marie Roca-Jones. Very happy to do this every month to all the listeners and viewers of the Goodman Project, the conversations that no one else is having. Like tonight, when you don't hear this online or in the media that often, we have two gentlemen who are very knowledgeable and passionate about this subject sharing, and that's what the Goodman Project is all about. So as always, we like to say, we'll see you next month, and it is the holiday season, so best holiday season wishes to all the men and their families out there. Take care, and we'll see you in 2015. Bye-bye.